Be informed, be inspired. Join us for the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show. Tune in and listen for both modern and ancient wisdom on all things maternity, parenting and sacred women's business, right here on the Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond show.
Welcome to Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond radio show. Our show is coming to you from the studios of Bay FM in Byron Bay and is broadcasting across Australia on the Community Radio Network. When you want something that for many is fundamental to their human existence, a biological drive to carry a baby, nurture a baby, to raise a family, it can be emotionally devastating for a couple or individual when, despite all the attempts, falling pregnant or keeping a pregnancy just isn't happening. 1 in 6 couples in Australia and New Zealand experience infertility. The infertility lies equally with both men and women, 40% each. 10% in both partners and the other 10% is unknown. Age does play a role in fertility issues. Couples in their 20s, for example, have a 25% chance of falling pregnant, whereas 1 in 3 women over the age of 35 experience infertility issues, and once she reaches 40, women have only 5% chance of falling pregnant with regular sexual activity. This episode of Pregnancy, Birth and Beyond shine a light on the often silent yet emotionally painful topic of infertility, from the personal account of my guest to her professional insights working with women and families experiencing the grief of not falling pregnant when wanting a baby. My guest for this episode is Kimberly Lipschus, who is a women's wellbeing and fertility psychotherapist. And you're here with me, Lara Martin. Welcome to the studio, Kimberly.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Kimberly, I thought let's just get started and perhaps you could just tell us what exactly is infertility. How is that classified and what are some issues with that?
Infertility is it's a word a little bit laden in my therapist rooms, but it's used when a woman or a couple are unable to fall pregnant or hold a pregnancy. It's kind of my loose definition, or they've been trying for a period of more than 6 months. I don't like to use the word infertility because it's almost like it's got a negative attachment to it. But so I often say fertility challenges, but I do steer away from it a bit.
And Kimberly, can you share with us a bit on the industry of fertility challenges? How big of an industry has that become?
It is massive. The industry itself in Australia, it's a $5 million industry for IVF alone. It's interesting that the infertility industry is just IVF, and yet not every couple or woman chooses to go down the IVF route. So that kind of casts out a lot of people. But it's a big industry. It's got a lot of money. And in 2013, the first IVF clinic floated on the stock exchange, which privatised it. So that changed the sphere considerably for how the medical treatments were handed out, really.
I also wanted to hear how you got into this body of work with working with women and couples with fertility challenges.
So I met my partner later in life, and we found that we were naive, really, in our late 30s to falling pregnant. So I had my first miscarriage at, I think it was 36 or 37, and I was studying at the time to become a psychotherapist, and I remember sitting in the day surgery and had to sign a form for an excavation of contents, and that moment kind of changed my whole life, really, because of the clinicalisation and the term of my dead baby as a content. So from there I was told to go and get some support, and when I looked around to get the support, there was support if you have had an abortion, and there's a support if you've had a stillbirth, but there was nothing else. It's like that whole sphere of pregnancy or trying all the way through to the end of pregnancy, it just didn't exist. So I went, okay, well, there's no course for that, but I'm going to see if I can train as much as I can, and I'm going to be that person. So that was my very abridged version of how I got to do what I did and how my passion was really aroused. It started personally.
That miscarriage that happened where you weren't able to keep your baby, was it the one experience, or was this something that continued on for a period of time?
That's a really good question. It continued on for years. So I ended up having my first baby at 39. So it went for 3 or 4 years. And between my first baby and my second one, and then I've had 4 miscarriages. So I know well what that experience is like, and also chose to and not to at various times whether I would medicalise it or not. So I've had a few D&Cs, and the others I've done myself. And the treatment's been very varied as well from the medical community. But one thing that I realised when I was experiencing my own grief as a person, as a woman, was that it's very isolating, and you feel like you shouldn't talk about the fact that you're even pregnant until you're in week 12, which is really counterintuitive, because if you do have a miscarriage, you can't tell anyone because you shouldn't have told anyone that you were pregnant. And then it becomes a grief which is, as a therapist, is called a disenfranchised grief. So it's kind of, it goes unacknowledged. There's no baby to bury. It just passes a lot of people by, and it catches up and bites them later.
It's because I remember even when I was pregnant, there was these whisperings of, you don't tell anyone you're pregnant until 12 weeks, as you said. Are you suggesting that we do away with that concept and allow the woman to share her news whenever she feels like it and whatever comes?
I think it's personal. I think it's really personal, but it is strange that we shouldn't tell anyone in case something goes wrong, and then if something goes wrong, there's no one to support you. So it is personal. If you feel that you've got support in your inner sanctum and you don't want the outer world to know, if you're more of a private person, it's picking and choosing, but it's a strange concept. It is strange. If we were living in a tribe, everyone would know when they knew. They'd probably know instinctually anyway. So the kind of no secrets, we support each other thing.
And what about with you? How did you find support? Because there was over a number of years and over a number of miscarriages that you experienced.
Yeah. I'm writing about that in the book at the moment. I think a lot of it, because it was so, you're just dealing with it at the time. I did get some therapeutic support, a lot of that, but a lot of it kind of did come later, and much later actually. Even after children, there was a shock of like, oh, there's still sadness there, and as a professional, think, oh, I shouldn't be feeling that, but if it's unresolved, it needs to be resolved. So I got as much therapeutic support, and I had a really tight community around me of family and my partner. But that's another thing. You can really have different coping mechanisms. Men and women cope very differently, so it can split couples. But we traversed it as best as we could, and now retrospectively I'm looking back and going, wow, there really needs to be some more education around this.
You mentioned that sometimes you chose to, with the miscarriages, medicalise it, and sometimes you chose not to. Can you go into that, a little bit of that decision making? Yeah.
Well, and in terms of the miscarriages themselves, they can all be different. So my first one was a very profound pregnancy, which was problematic from the start, but it was a big bleed. There was a massive bleed, and we rang the hospital and they said, come in only when you're bleeding, and I went back to sleep. And I had this dream about this little girl that came and said, and she whispered in my ear, and I knew she was like my daughter, and she said, I've got to go, but I'm going to come back. And she left, and when I woke up, the bed was full of blood, and so that had to be hospitalised. We went into hospital, but not till the next day. That experience and the next one where the baby, that one, I'll leave that one. The second one was an early miscarriage, and I decided not to go to the hospital. We got blood tests done, and we knew that it had passed by, and I basically bled that out personally. And then the third one was, it's going back in memory, but the third one, they saw it on the ultrasound, And I decided to leave it, and they said, no, you need a D&C, and I said, I'm going to leave it. And after 10 days, I was still carrying around a dead baby, so we had to medicalise that as well and go through the hospital route. And the fourth one, I can't really recall. I do blur into one.
Thank you so much for sharing such personal, intimate stories, and one that many women actually experience, but there's so much silence around. And I've heard approximately 1 in 3 pregnancies end in a miscarriage, whether the woman knows that or not. Is that from your understanding?
Yes, yeah. And I think also because we have more, we've got more medication, so we've got the early pregnancy tests and we've got the urine tests. People know earlier, and so they know when they've lost as well, when often it might have been, could I be pregnant, and not realise that they've lost a baby as well.
You brought something up for me which I wanted to ask you about, and that was about the terms and the language that is used with women and couples and men who are experiencing these fertility challenges, particularly, on both sides, not being able to fall pregnant and then the other side falling pregnant and losing these babies. Could you tell us about the kind of language that is used?
Because it is a medical arena, or you enter a medical arena when something like that happens, you enter medical terms. So by default, it's no fault of the medical profession really, but they do have shortcuts on things that they call your condition, like the excavation of contents for a miscarriage. So when I was researching for the book that I'm writing, I put a little call out. I was curious about this, about anyone who felt that they were mishandled or that they were offended by the way they'd been treated. And in the social media call out, I had hundreds of responses within about an hour. And there were women that were still smarting and hurting and in a lot of pain about the way they felt that they'd been labelled, offended about their cervix being called incompetent cervix when they're in the middle of labour, or the excavation of contents came up. There was a woman who had, I think she was English, and she had been holding on for 20 years or more, that when she'd given birth, she turned around and looked at the top of the bed and it said non-milker because she wasn't able to breastfeed. So the terms for me then as a therapeutic thing, I realised that it's almost like a secondary victimisation. And that's kind of labelled as, it's not a direct result of trauma, but it's the response of institutions when someone has been traumatised, or to individuals. And if I kind of put that in a reproductive forum, it's like these people feel more pain about how they felt their experience was handled or worded or treated than the experience themselves. That comes up in the therapy room more than the actual, I had a miscarriage. It's more, they told me I was this, and they said my baby was an excavation of contents, or that, their baby who died early on after labour was incompatible with life. It feels very offensive and very, very personal.
And with this, Kimberly, with this language that's used and what's been shared with you, that how impersonal and hurtful that kind of wording is, I'm wondering what is it about that? What story is coming up with the people you see, the clients you see around their fertility issues when they express the language and the experience?
There's kind of like two aspects to that, Lara. I reckon that their personal story is removed from them, so they don't feel their story is worthy. So that's the first thing. So the first thing that I want to hear is their story. Or they think, it doesn't matter, it's not important. But their story is personal to them, and no one else has that story. So that's the first thing. The way that they felt let down or dehumanised or absent from larger conversations has a massive impact, I believe, where they learnt to distrust their body and to trust the medical system, which is necessary, but it needn't be one or the other. They can trust a medical team inherently, but they also need to trust their own instinctual journey. And when they're severed from their own instincts, they're almost thrown into a place in between worlds where they don't trust, firstly, their experience. They don't trust their body to be able to do what it does. And often I find that the skeleton woman, a myth that I often refer to,